Hello and welcome to another episode of Idioms of Normality, brought to you by Future Frame TV and Traces.Dreams. I am here today with a very special person, Erna Walraven, who is an Emeritus zookeeper and Emeritus curator, but also the author of Wild Leadership, a book published recently by New Holland, What Wild Animals Teach Us About Leadership. Erna, thank you so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure.
And before I jump in with the first question, what perspectives and experiences do you bring to the question of normality?
Well, I guess everyone is shaped by their experiences. Growing up in Holland, being a migrant in Spain, coming to Australia as a migrant, being one of the first female zookeepers, being a loud woman with opinions, all of those shape my sense of what's normal, I suppose.
Well, then let me just jump in with the first question. What is normal?
The only thing I can do is assume that I am normal and judge the rest of the world on that basis.
Isn't that what we all do, isn't it?
I'm sure we're all on a spectrum of normality. I'm somewhere on it, and that's my starting point.
I think that's the perspective of a lot of people. I'm normal, and everyone else around me is going to be judged by the barometer of my own normality.
I am compared to them.
With this career as a zookeeper and a curator, you would bring some really interesting perspectives about normality in the rest of nature.
Yeah, I mean, that's a real challenge when you care for wild animals in captivity. You want to give them as normal a life as you possibly can. And I always like to challenge my colleagues because I wanted the animals to have some negative experience as well as only positive experiences. Because we were very keen on making sure they had happy lives. But I very much had the opinion that you had to have some negative experiences in order to judge how good you've got it. Like when you go out for a nice walk and suddenly a thunderstorm comes and you become absolutely soaking wet. The coming home, having the hot shower and putting warm clothes on and sitting in front of the fire with a red wine is much nicer than if you hadn't gotten wet in the first place. So I felt that to try and create as much normal for them as we possibly could, we should allow them to have some challenges in life too. And that is difficult because challenges in life can create stress, and stress can lower the immune system, and then you get something and you die. Obviously, you don't want that for your animals. So it's always a very fine balance. The reason I wrote the book on leadership is because I saw a lot of leadership challenges amongst the animals, and that is normal. And we need to allow that to happen. But it might mean that one of the two fighting over the alpha position is going to get injured. And there's nothing you can do about that. So what's normal for the animals that we care for in a zoo is not always nice. I want them to get into fights because they need to sort out their hierarchy. I want them to get cold and wet occasionally without them getting sick. Normal is not just a good life. A life has good and bad, and challenges are stimulating. So that was always something I found very hard to discuss with colleagues without sounding like I was someone who was quite happy to put animals through all sorts of hardships.
That's a really interesting perspective because life is full of both adversity as well as comfort, but we live in a risk-averse society, particularly in Australia. And some of that risk aversion bleeds into the way in which some people feel we should care for other animals.
You see the mollycoddling of people's pets. You think, well, does that dog still know it's a dog? And one of my colleagues and I invented a term, and we talked about that a lot, and that was the possumness of possum, or the gibbonness of gibbon. What are those essences of what it is to be a gibbon, and how do we give that to them? What is their part of normal? If we're talking about normal, what is normal for a gibbon to experience, and how can we create that? We could never ever create the world they would find themselves in the wild, but the wild is no utopia either. So we try to often give them too much of a good thing. And I think every being likes to be challenged to a degree. How much challenge is normal, and how far do you allow that to go before it becomes a negative animal welfare experience?
So
But
what are normal stress levels? What is
yeah,
normal adversity? What are some normal
that's
challenges
right. Yeah,
without
yeah,
without creating insurmountable
yeah.
obstacles for the animal to
Yeah,
thrive?
and that is different for individual animals too. Just like some of us have more resilience than others, and if we are challenged, some of us might find it quite easy to deal with the challenge, whereas others are extremely worried by it. And with animals in a group, you're going to have exactly the same different personalities that can cope with the challenges thrown at them. So the challenges can be really minimal, like, hide their food in a particular way so that they have to spend more time looking for it. Providing them with challenges, like we used to like to put poo of one of the ungulate species in with the tigers one day, or the slough of a snake, and the animals go, oh my God, I can smell it. Where is it? And especially if it's a snake, they would take for ages to try and work out what it is. And that mental stimulation that provides is really good. But long-term stress is really bad. So how much of that stuff do you do? And how many challenges on any given day are normal when you live in the wild? Probably quite a lot. That would be normal. How do we replicate that without negatively impacting the overall well-being of the animal? It was always difficult to assess. And you need to monitor the animals really closely to be able to work that out.
My mind is going in several directions as you're talking. On one level, I'm thinking about, when you remove all those stressors on the animal, their behavior sort of starts to free roll in a new direction. And sometimes that can lead to things like over grooming. If there's not enough
Yeah,
stimulation, if there's not
yeah,
enough
yeah,
enrichment
yeah,
in their habitat,
yeah.
then they start doing behaviors which
Mm,
almost mimic in some ways some of the mental health issues we see in humans, although in
yeah,
its own
yeah.
gibbonness way or in its own
The possumness of possum way.
the
Yeah,
possumness way.
yeah. I think boredom can lead to that for sure. And I wrote some papers at one stage because we were getting really good at the goals that we were setting about managing the genetics of the animals well into the future. So if zoos say, okay, well, we'll have all these precious packages of genetic uniqueness, and we're going to manage that for a very long time so that if the chance exists to release those animals back, then we've got perfectly capable animals to do that. And the goals for that are preserve 90% of the amount of genetic diversity found in the wild over a 100-year period. So that's the absolute standard that all the breeding programs are run by.
That would be
Um,
quite a challenge.
and that is quite a challenge because you've got to have enough unique material to start with. So you've got to have a good population to start with, and you've got to know who fathered and mothered whom and all of that. Who were the contributors over the generations? But you can manage that. But then I was very interested in how do we do that with behavior, because we are choosing for captivity. Every time we breed animals, and the ones that survive are the ones that have coped best with being in human care. So you do that for multiple generations. You start to virtually get domestication. I mean, that's how wolves, became dogs and went from Pekingese to Great Danes. I mean, really, that was
Mm.
humans breeding them and selecting them for certain traits. We are not consciously selecting for certain traits, but you do in the way, if the animal survives and takes very well to the kind of keepers that it has, the kind of food that it gets, it reacts well to the vaccinations it's given, etc., etc., then you are choosing for captivity by default. That's a problem, but how do you know which behaviors are learned and which are innate? So I at least wanted to start a global zoo system whereby we try to identify which behaviors are learned and how do we make sure that one generation teaches the next generation. I mean, innate behaviors, the blueprint of a bird to migrate or whatever, or for a lizard to be able to pip out of the egg, or we have to assume they know that. But we know that caring for an infant when you're a primate, you have no idea how to do that unless your mother did that for you. And even better if you grow up in a group where there are other females, and at the time where you become sexually mature, you see other females that do this mothering behavior and you learn from that, and they might even let you hold them occasionally, and you learn some things. We know that. And it's hard to talk about animal intelligence because I think they're all intelligent, but animals like primates do have more learned behavior, and some of that can be taught if the behavior has been lost in some way. You can retrain them.
So, in breeding animals for release, it's not just about genetic health, it's also about behavioral health, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Unless the animal is normal, as we're talking about normal, you don't want some half-wit with the wrong behaviors being released because that's going to upset everyone. So if we release regent honey eaters, we want to be sure that they sing the same tune as the honey eaters they're going to meet because they'll be ostracized. So you want tape recordings of the right dialect, and you make sure you play that to them over and over and over to make sure you get it right.
It's interesting how you talk about, there might be several generations between the wild animal being caught and then the captive animal being released. And in those several generations in between, there is behavioral change, genetic selection, consciously or unconsciously,
Yeah.
and in some ways can shift the evolution of the gene pool of that particular sample
Yeah.
of the species. It can also introduce some new behavioral traits. I know, for example, with the Tasmanian devil, when they released animals into wild again, they found that Tasmanian devils that had been in captivity were more likely to be victims of roadkill because they were more comfortable living in close proximity to
Yeah.
human settlements
Mm.
and human
Yeah.
movement. So this is a really important dimension of understanding the range of behavior of an
Mm.
animal
Yeah.
so that it's not just released into the wild without any preparation, but
Yeah.
it's also behaviorally fit for perhaps habitats that have also changed in the meantime as well.
Yeah, well, that's another thing that zoos tend to be very wary of is making sure the animal has the right genetic mix to meet the right climatic conditions. I can't remember now what species it was. It was some hoofed animal somewhere that had become extinct somewhere. There was a large population in human care. They came from a slightly different area. They were bred up and released there, and they gave birth when it was still full of snow. They had the wrong month of the
Oh,
year
the
in bred.
gestation
I
period
can't
in
remember now the
the
full story,
circadian
but
rhythms.
yeah. So obviously, I mean, I think that was in the 70s somewhere. If you're doing that kind of work, all these things embed themselves as little flags in your head when you are planning to do any releases. And most releases are done with a small sample size and see how they go. And
I'm discovering that for myself. I keep stick insects,
oh, yeah.
and the people I communicate with who have stick insects as well, I'm noticing that our eggs are all hatching at different times of the year,
Mm,
and it's kind of telling about the different climatic conditions in different households, maybe the different light dark
yeah.
cycles. I'm not sure what's playing in there because
Yeah.
there's too many variables, but obviously there's an influence of the environment on
Yeah.
the animal, whether that's a domesticated human environment or whether that's a wild, free environment.
And there are so many things that can influence the hormones that the animal exudes at a certain time so that it'll come into season, et cetera, et cetera. So there's so many aspects that we often don't even know what's normal in the wild because the animal hasn't been studied well enough, or there are aspects. So often we're asked to take these animals into our care so that we can work out what happens. Who sits on the eggs? No one's ever known whether it's the male and the female. Do they swap over? Also, the regent honey eaters, we were asked by the National Parks and Wildlife Service to keep track of when they develop. They have these lumpy bits of skin that color up around their eyes. And we are now able to age them on that because we've been able to document it over time. So, that's much harder to do with a pair of binoculars. And so that sort of stuff can be done so that sometimes in human care, you can work out what's normal in the wild. But there's still the question of, did our very nice nutrition at all times contribute to them developing faster than would be normal in the wild? So lots of questions.
I want to ask about what is normal leadership as well, but before I go into that, I want to pick up on something you said before, and that was talking about the essence, the possumness, the gibbonness of gibbons, the possumness of possums. The reason my ears pricked up and the reason I sort of want to throw something difficult into the conversation is because I feel that the concept of normality in some ways is about finding the essence of a group. What is normal for that group is about finding the essence of that group, markers of what defines the characteristics of that group. What is normal for French people? What is normal for Indonesian people? What is normal in a population? And we come out with these ideas of the average, the median, the mode. And in some ways, though, we are seeing a population at a very specific point in time. I wonder if there's a possibility that the thinking behind looking for an essence in a population or an essence of a species is perhaps got some of the same flaws that the mathematics of the average has for human populations.
When we talk very much about the gibbonness of gibbon, it had to do with what were the essential elements that mattered to the animal of that species. What would make a gibbon feel like it's a gibbon? What are those elements? Is it the fact that you can brachiate? Is it the fact that you can sing your duets? What are those integral things that would make a possum happy as opposed to a gibbon or a kookaburra or whatever else it may be? So that's really what we meant by the essence of. We needed to understand the animal's normal in the wild, normal in its social circumstances, normal in its climatic conditions, all of those normals, to be able to hopefully deduct which ones of those would give it the essential components to find its gibbonness of gibbon.
It sounds like that would be a very difficult task, given that humans would have a very subjective bias on the adaptive traits for that organism and the non-adaptive traits for that organism. Because, a gibbon, centuries from now will no longer be a gibbon. Humans were not humans 2 million years ago. We were Australopithecus afarensis and we were Homo neanderthalensis. And so
some of us more than others.
I believe I'm 4%. Yes.
Oh, are you? Oh, okay.
My great-great-great-grandfather, yes. You also mentioned dogs and you alluded to the idea of fur babies. And I remember walking down pet food aisle in a shopping centre with a friend of mine from overseas, and they were so confused at seeing not just the pet food, the whole aisle of pet food, but all the pet toys, the pet comforts, the pet grooming tools. And it kind of makes me wonder if, with some of our domesticated animals, and dogs are the example you used, and the dogs are the ones that are fresh in my mind, I wonder if sometimes human behavior can be terribly confusing and, if not, emotionally abusive, because on one hand, we groom our dogs so much. We groom them, we look after them, we feed them, we care after them. We give them food and we don't hold back necessarily on that. And yet, on the same time, we also deny them a lot of behaviors. So in some areas, we're telling the dog, you're the leader. We are going to groom you like you're the leader. We're going to look after you like you're the leader. But then at other times of the day, we're putting the dog in its place and saying you are not the leader. And I
No.
just wonder from the dog's perspective,
Yeah.
if the dog's going, hang on, am I the leader or am I not the leader? This is terribly confusing for me.
I think dogs are terribly confused, and I think most of them do not have the dogness of dog. Because to be a dog, you've got to have a pack, and I believe you've got to probably the dogs, not with other humans, because you want to run wild with the other dogs. You know, you think of when did I last see a dog that looked really happy? It was a few days ago on the beach, and there were about 3 dogs off the leash running like mad. And to me, they look in that moment, they were very happy dogs. I think a dog likes to get wet and muddy and grubby and wants to have a good run. I don't know that, the most of the dogs in human care would not have as good a time as I think they deserve. It's a bit controversial perhaps to say that, but just because you love them doesn't mean they are as happy as they should be.
And I think some dog breeders would probably share your opinions, although they might come to different
Yeah,
ideas at the end of it.
yeah.
They certainly would share the question, that is this normal dog behavior,
Yeah.
or is this person going to look after the dog the way I would like this dog to be looked after? And there are some obstacles here, and one of them is, we as humans bring anthropocentrism and
Yeah.
anthropomorphic ideas and project our own ideas of what it is to be human onto our ideas of what it is to be a dog. What
Yeah.
are some of the challenges of anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism?
Well, when I first started as a zookeeper in the early 1980s, it was very much frowned upon to be anthropomorphic at all times. That changed a lot when Frans de Waal, my other Dutch favorite, started to write books about chimpanzee politics and animal emotion. And there were more and more scientists coming on board with saying, well, yeah, if you see a female chimpanzee and her baby was still born and she is sitting there holding that baby looking dejected, she's probably sad. But before that time, we were not allowed to say that. If we were doing the record, we would say, female such and such, baby stillborn, mother refusing food, holding baby, or something like that. The interpretation of putting what seemed like logical emotions to witness under the circumstances. So there's a limit to how much you should anthropomorphize, but if they are species that are very much like us and we see reactions that would be very normal under the circumstances, I think it is reasonable to suggest that the animal has very similar feelings to us under those circumstances, if it is, a primate or whatever. Just like people can read their dogs, we spend a lot of time as zookeepers with animals. Like, most people, if they get the lead, the dog goes crazy, gets very excited, and knows we're going walkies. The animals we look after, we spend all day with them. So we get to read them a lot better. And you do need to guard for blatant anthropomorphism, but to acknowledge the animals have feelings, and those feelings are probably very similar to our feelings. I have seen jealousy, hurt, embarrassment, a lot of those sentiments that we can verbalize. I've seen them in animals, like an animal that stumbles and falls over, quickly looks up, and you almost think they've got a little sheepish look on their face, like, I hope nobody saw that.
I think
um,
that's me most mornings. Yeah.
yeah. So there's a fine line. If you go too far in putting your emotions on the animal, you'll probably get it wrong. But there's a reasonable amount of assessment that can be done on the basis that they have emotions, we have emotions, and we probably have a very similar range of emotions. We share these common ancestors. A lot of these emotions go back before we split off from those ancestors, and we probably share a lot of emotions with a range of animals.
This is a nice segue moment to talk about your book and to talk about leadership, because one thing I really like about your book is you explore a lot of the different animals and leadership within these
Mm.
different animals on their own terms. In some ways, you offer some really interesting examples to think with,
Mm.
but you don't create archetypes of leadership based on, such a human leader is a gibbon leader or something. You don't create these very
No,
anthropomorphic or anthropocentric
yeah,
ideas. But tell me a little bit about what constitutes a normal leader.
I don't know that there is a normal. I think a leader has to have empathy, integrity, to be able to react to the situations. I don't think anyone is a born leader. I think some people are more adapt to leadership than others, but I think a lot of leadership is learned too. I think we pick it up as we go because you've got to make a lot of mistakes. But some people are indeed much wiser to it at a much younger age. There are people that are, in their late teenage years already seem to show the qualities of leadership. And those qualities, I believe, are compassion is very high up in that, understanding others and taking the time to understand others probably makes you a better leader. But I don't know what be normal in leadership. I mean, we certainly know when it's not normal, when we see it. We go, oh, that's no good.
I understand where you're going with that.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to avoid very much to use political leadership currently as examples because it's too easy a target.
What I find really interesting about your book is, for me, what really comes home is that context matters. You can't understand the qualities of leadership based on the individual alone, whether you're talking about an individual gorilla or whether you're talking about an individual
Yeah,
chimpanzee. You can't understand those leadership qualities without understanding the context of the group. One of those very prominent contextual features was the patterns of gendered dynamics within a group,
yeah,
very much playing a role in the different modes of leadership that make sense for that particular group, if not
yeah.
species.
Well, all leadership has to adapt to the circumstances and the followers, the people they lead, if it's people or the animals they lead. And I very much wanted to write the book from the perspective of the what the followers get out of it. Because leadership is often about the leader. Most leadership courses and leadership books is all about how the leader should act, what the leader should do, what characteristics the leader has. Whereas I want to know what the followers will have expectations of the leadership that they deserve. We deserve good leadership. So, if we deserve good leadership, then what are the expectations of the followers, and how do leaders make sure that they meet those expectations? So, that was really the angle I took on that because we've all seen bad leaders. We've seen very few good leaders in our times. And a lot of that has to do that, in a work situation or your teacher, you don't choose them. They're often more managers than leaders. I think there's probably a difference there.
There's a very, very strong difference, isn't there, between leadership and management, isn't there?
Mm, yeah,
To manage people is very different than to lead people.
yeah,
Your book was interesting for me on a number of levels, and I don't normally like to throw in too many of my own ideas when I interview someone, but I feel it's relevant here. And I've taught leadership courses for a decade now, and you're absolutely right that there's not enough focus on the followers, because not every student I'm teaching is going to be working in identifiable leadership
mm,
roles.
yeah,
But they all need to know that as a follower, they need to decide whether or not they're getting out of their leader
mm,
something they want. And this
yeah,
is a very strong point in your book, which is the followers get something out of the different leadership styles.
mm,
And even if the leadership is bad and very short-lived, the followers have to decide whether or not they're getting something out of that.
yeah,
And if they're not, they will maneuver to try and change it at
yeah,
some point. Sooner if it's bad leadership, and I think it's really important to think about what it means to be a follower, because you can still have leadership qualities within you by
Yeah.
either being an informal leader
Mm,
or by deciding whether or not you're going to follow.
mm,
And part of the question for me of asking what is normal to different experts is really about asking what is the status quo and do we accept it?
yeah.
Because if you look at the history of the whole concept of normality, it was very much a concept developed by the political elite. And it was a concept that was popularized as a method to moralize populations into
Mm,
assuming very, very
yeah.
standardized models of behavior. So by questioning things like normality, we can question what it means to be the kind of follower you want to be.
Yep. I agree.
Becoming a good follower, was that a driver for this book?
I wanted to understand, I wanted people to understand that if they weren't happy in particular workplaces, it might be because their expectations of their leader weren't met. Often there's nothing much we can do about that other than leave. You know, there's change of leadership when you're in the workplace is very hard to achieve. But I do have some the power of the followers. I've got a couple of sections in the book about that, about how some protests may seem futile, but they do in many times lead to better outcomes. So I'm obviously for a bit of a revolution every now and then. I think, revolution's all right as long as nobody gets hurt. But followers need to understand they do have some power in certain situations. And certainly we have the power of our vote. Obviously, it's been a very short time for women to have that power, but luckily in most places we now do, but still not around the world. So interesting. I think writing this stuff when you're a woman, when you've had the public opinion of being assertive in a man is aggressive in a woman, and and particularly in leadership positions, you get that a lot. And then, as we talked before, you come to any kind of role, any kind of position with how you've been shaped through your experiences. Being a Dutch person makes me rather outspoken and opinionated in the first place. Coming to a different culture, then having to tone that down. By coming to Australia, I had to be very careful that whenever I had leadership roles, I was very careful not to be considered as too out there, especially in the early 80s when Australia was still quite a bit more conservative in terms of feminism than it is now. So it's been an interesting
My
idea to
mum,
write about leadership in
my
that
mum
with,
was
with that
Dutch.
background. Yeah.
My mum was Dutch, and so I'm familiar with the idea that, particularly, it can blend into each other. Her cultural background, which was very much about say it as it is, be very
Yeah.
direct, don't beat around the bush. But coming to Australia, a lot of people don't necessarily get to the point straight away, and it's not always seen as polite to get to the point
Yeah.
straight away. And that wasn't a masculine or a feminine trait, but in the
Mm,
Australian context, it was understood in those terms. It
yeah.
was understood as less than feminine to get right to the point. Or
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm really enjoying this discussion, and I feel like I could go on forever. And the last question I ask my interviewees is, what questions can we ask about normality? And the way I'd like to pose this question to you is, what are the questions we should ask about the norms we come to expect from our leaders and the
Mm.
norms that we expect from ourselves as followers?
Well, I would like to see that people at least question whether a leader, or if they are a leader, whether they are considering that it is normal to make the decisions for the greater good of the society that they lead. Because that is one that is not always clear as we look at current politics, business, the church. It should be normal for a leader to make every decision to be one that benefits the greater good of the followers they lead. And I think that should be a question about normality in an ideal world.
Erna Walraven, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for being an interviewee on Idioms of Normality, brought to you by Future Frame TV and Traces.Dreams.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and we'll chat again. Bye-bye.